For the first time in decades, a Cuban president has gone on the record and admitted something many analysts only suspected. Havana is quietly negotiating with Washington. That admission is a political earthquake by Cuban standards, not proof that the island's communist project is finished, but a clear signal that the government feels pressured enough to open a direct channel with its historic adversary. Under certain conditions, these talks could accelerate a transformation that ends one-party rule as Cuba has known it. They could also lead to a managed deal that preserves the regime in a weaker form. Which path unfolds depends on forces playing out now inside Cuba and across the region. Cuba's immediate visible problem is a severe energy collapse. Reports of rolling blackouts that last a dozen hours or more, intermittent fuel deliveries, and a crippled transport system are not abstract statistics. They are lived reality for millions of families. Hospitals operate on emergency power, food supply chains slow to a crawl, bakeries and clinics ration diesel, and lines at gas stations stretch into the night. When the grid fails routinely, the state's basic capacity to govern, to provide services and maintain order, frays. That operational failure has real political consequences: localized protests, attacks on party installations in some neighborhoods, and an erosion of popular patience that lingers from the mass demonstrations of 2021. Those protests showed that citizens are willing to take to the streets, and the memory of that moment remains potent beneath the surface. So why would Havana pick up the phone and negotiate with Washington now? The short answer is leverage. For decades, the Cuban state survived by combining four pillars: an exclusive political monopoly that bars organized opposition, a security and surveillance apparatus that deters or crushes dissent, a revolutionary legitimacy story that frames the regime as defender of sovereignty against foreign interference, and external patrons that provided energy, credit, and diplomatic cover. Those pillars were resilient enough to ride out earlier shocks, the post-Soviet special period being the most acute, because Moscow and later Caracas supplied a life support system. Today, that external buffer is thinner. Venezuela is no longer a reliable energy donor at scale. Russia and China offer diplomatic gestures and selective investments, but stop well short of replacing the old subsidy model. Without a steady stream of external resources, the Cuban state's fourth pillar weakens, and the other three pillars become harder to sustain under sustained material strain. This conjuncture is different from earlier crises in one crucial way. Multiple vulnerabilities are aligning simultaneously. Past shocks hit one dimension, economic or political, and the regime adapted through austerity, targeted giveaways, or repression. What we see today is energy shortages that directly degrade the state's everyday functions, at the same time that social dissatisfaction from 2021 has not disappeared, and external patrons no longer provide a reliable lifeline. Add in global inflation, climate shocks that affect food and power, and a diaspora increasingly mobilized in fundraising and political pressure, and you have a rare confluence of stressors. When an authoritarian government faces operational failure, legitimacy narratives fray because citizens experience the mismatch between state rhetoric and daily reality. That is the opening Washington's negotiators appear to be testing. What can the United States realistically ask for, and what can it offer in return? Negotiations are bargaining. Each side has leverage and red lines. Washington's leverage in the short term is straightforward: access to energy imports, financial engagement, and the global economic system. The immediate American offer could include expedited deliveries of fuel, targeted humanitarian assistance, and conditional easing of some sanctions to allow transactions for essential goods and services. Over the medium term, U.S. negotiators are likely to condition larger economic incentives on political concessions, the release or improved treatment of reported political prisoners, legal safeguards for civil society and independent media, and concrete steps to open up sections of the economy to foreign investment, potentially including U.S. businesses, under transparent rules. Strategically, Washington could press Havana to reduce its security cooperation with states that the United States views as adversaries. What that looks like in practice is complex and sensitive. The U.S. cannot plausibly demand wholesale geopolitical realignment in a single negotiation, but it can seek to limit certain types of military, intelligence, or logistical cooperation that bolster its rivals. All of this depends on what Havana values more in the short term: immediate relief that keeps electricity flowing and hospitals running, or a hardline posture that preserves ideological consistency but risks domestic meltdown. These are high stakes because the bargaining space intersects directly with regime survival. Give too much and the party loses its monopoly, give too little and the grid keeps failing. The Cuban leadership can calibrate concessions to preserve the core of single-party control while opening economic space that relieves pressure without ceding political power. That is the most likely equilibrium, absent a dramatic internal rupture. But several pathways remain plausible, and it helps to think through scenarios and the triggers that would push the island from one to another. The first scenario is short-term containment, limited concessions, temporary relief. In this outcome, Havana accepts targeted energy deliveries and makes small economic adjustments, temporary permits for private enterprise, modest currency measures, or pilot joint ventures with foreign firms. The regime uses selective releases or furloughs of reported political prisoners as goodwill gestures, while security forces retain tight control over organized politics. The government survives but is visibly weakened. Legitimacy is fragile and depends on continued external support. Indicators that this scenario is unfolding include steady, predictable fuel shipments, a handful of token releases, and economic decrees aimed at short-term fixes rather than structural reform. The second, medium-term scenario is gradual erosion and managed opening, negotiated partial transformation. Here talks deepen into a more systematic bargain between elements of the Cuban elite and international actors. The state liberalizes key economic sectors, permits broader private enterprise, and creates legal pathways for foreign investment while maintaining the Communist Party's role in political life. In return, the international community, possibly led by the U.S., and multilateral institutions, provides reconstruction funds, tourism partnerships, and phased sanction relief. This transition is managed and negotiated, reducing the risk of violent implosion, but producing a slower, more profound political shift. The single-party system's monopoly diminishes in practice, even if some formal structures remain. Indicators to watch for this trajectory include new legal frameworks enabling foreign contracts, sustained openings to U.S. firms or investors, a pattern of systematic prisoner releases with legal changes to allow political organizing and elite-level signaling, resignations, public statements by business or military figures favoring pragmatic reform. The third scenario, lower probability but high impact, is rapid collapse or sudden elite split. This would require a decisive fracture within the regime's coercive core. For example, if key security commanders defect or if economic breakdown triggers mass unrest that overwhelms state capacity, external actors can influence this outcome, but sudden collapse usually follows internal elite disunity or a catastrophic failure in essential services that the state cannot remedy quickly. Such an outcome would be destabilizing regionally, triggering refugee flows and a chaotic scramble among external powers to shape the post-collapse settlement. Indicators to watch for an escalating risk here include visible fractures among senior leaders, security forces either standing down or using indiscriminate force that alienates their own ranks, and a rapid, uncontrollable expansion of protests beyond localized disturbances. Across all scenarios, certain watch points will be especially telling. First, fuel and energy flows. Who is supplying diesel and how consistently? Second, the treatment and status of reported political prisoners. Are releases strategic and public, or are detainees simply moved or repressed? Third, economic policy signals. Are there concrete legal changes allowing foreign investment, currency reforms, or privatization pilots? Fourth, the scale and geography of protests. Isolated incidents differ from nationwide mobilization. Fifth, signs of elite realignment, defections, public resignations, or a shift in rhetoric from high-level officials. Sixth, shifts in foreign ties. Increased diplomatic or economic support from Russia, China, or third-party actors would indicate continued external lifelines, while new agreements with Western firms or states suggest opening. The regional and global implications of any Cuban pivot would be significant but varied. In Washington, a negotiated thaw that produces tangible improvements would be cast as a strategic win, reduced influence for adversaries in the hemisphere, and a diplomatic success. For Latin America, the reverberations would depend on domestic politics. Some governments would see opportunities for increased trade and migration, while others would worry about destabilizing spillovers. Russia and China would likely respond pragmatically, protecting strategic interests and investments while recalibrating their support, but they are unlikely to replicate the sort of subsidized patronage that sustained Havana during the Cold War. Migration patterns deserve close attention. If economic hardship deepens or political repression spikes, migration to neighboring countries and the U.S. could surge, with attendant humanitarian and security challenges. It is crucial to remember what these talks represent: a sign of pressure, not a forecast of collapse. Public admission of negotiations is politically costly for an authoritarian leader because it concedes vulnerability. That concession may be calculated, an attempt to extract immediate relief while managing domestic perceptions, or it could be the first step in a negotiated path toward structural change. Which it becomes will depend on choices by Cuban leaders, the coherence of U.S. policy, the role of regional partners, and unpredictable catalysts on the ground. If you want updates on this developing story, subscribe and hit the bell. In the weeks and months ahead, watch for concrete signals rather than rhetoric, reliable indicators, fuel deliveries and whether they are sustained, new economic decrees and foreign contracts, verified releases of reported political prisoners accompanied by legal reforms, clear movement of Cuban diplomacy away from adversary states, and the trajectory of public protest will tell a far more useful story than speculation. Pay attention to elite behavior too, a quiet reshuffle of top officials or a public rebuke between military and party figures could matter more than slogans on a plaza. The admission that Cuba is negotiating with the United States is one of the clearest signs yet that Havana feels strategic pressure. That pressure could be the opening to negotiated transformations that end the Communist Party's monopoly in practice, or it could result in a weakened but enduring regime that survives by adapting. Either way, the coming months promise to be decisive. Like, share, and subscribe for in-depth follow-ups as events unfold. Tell us in the comments which indicator you'll be watching.